Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I have been practicing to get the sound executed excellently, and I'm sure you'll agree I've achieved that. Lovely to have you here for the Planning and Regeneration Committee for the London Assembly. Welcome to those joining us online and in person. Members of the public may like to follow us at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Please, I remind participants to silence your devices. Today, we are holding the second session of a two-part investigation into the future of planning in London, and we will be considering the impact of the planning provisions contained within the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assembly Member Baker.
We will miss her, thank you. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interest in any specific items listed on the agenda? Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 7th of September 2022? Fantastic. And can we note the completed, closed and outstanding actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee? Great. Can we note the recent action taken by myself as chair under delegated authority following consultation with the party group lead members to agree the letter of the Mayor of London, to the Mayor of London rather, regarding the draft London Plan guidance on housing design standards and small site design codes? Great. So that brings us to our main item of business, as I sort of said, the second part of our investigation into the future of planning in London, where we will be looking at the planning provisions contained within the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And just to offer some context to our guests, thank you so much for joining us. The first part of this investigation, we had a really fantastic array of voices from community groups, those representing wider organisations across London, to talk about their experiences of the planning system, so that we're not just looking at responding to the reforms as they exist, but also if you did have a blank piece of paper and you sort of started again, what would you want from a planning system in London? And we've tried to embed and engage some of those ideas in our questions to you today, and it will be forming part of our outputs as we go forward. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you. I might actually go around and do a formal introduction. We've got Mita Kura, the partner from Town Legal LLP. Thank you for joining us, Mita. Joe Dromey, the director from Central London Forward. Nice to see you, Joe. Angela Koch, Neighbourhood Planners London and Imagine Places. Hi, Angela. Deneen Rowe from Planning Aid for London, which has partnered with Town and Country Planning Association. Great to have you join us. And Jules Pipe, CBE, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. And I think in my chairship, this is the first time we're having you at the committee, so it's great to have you here, Jules. Thank you for joining us. Lisa Fairmanor, Head of London Plan and Growth Strategies at the GLA. Great to have you, Lisa. And John Weecher, Strategic Planner Manager, Viability from the GLA. Thank you very much for joining us, John. So let's crack on. We'll be starting off with sort of, obviously, our slightly more broader questions, and I think I'll open up by addressing this to you, Jules. How has the Mayor engaged with the government during the development of the national planning reforms and the passage of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill?
Thank you, Chair. Well, there have been a whole succession of proposals, white papers, bills, secretaries of state, housing ministers, local government ministers that we've, and of course then an ever-changing array of Treasury ministers as well, that the Mayor has engaged with over the last 18 months, 2 years, on various proposals that have come forward from the government. I suppose if we allow the music to stop and just adopt the chairs as they are at the moment, laid out at the moment, being the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, we've got sort of a number of principal concerns about it that can be pretty easily summarised. The first is the infrastructure levy and the effects that that would have on infrastructure funding, particularly affordable housing, and the effect being detrimental, if I'm not being obvious in the way that I've said that. Then there's the introduction of the national development policies and the impacts that they will have, and trumping any other planning local plans adopted by anyone in the country, and giving a huge unfettered amount of power to any Secretary of State of the day in the future. so that relationship, that's the third thing, the relationship between the statutory development plan and those new national policies as they are ever developed. And ultimately that has an enormous effect on the future of the London plan. And I think that, to give a kind of a simple example, take how the GLA has consistently been in the vanguard of energy saving and CO2 policies. And consistently the government, the national requirements have played catch up with what's been set at City Hall. So even if the government was to adopt as a national policy what we thought was currently a good benchmark, it would prevent us from improving that benchmark in the future, because it's specifically ruled out us having a policy on anything in which the government alights on as an NDMP. So yeah, I can go in at length, but I know that you like us to be brief. But I'm more than happy to come back on detail on those areas.
We don't really want you to be brief, actually. I think go for it. We want to hear, I suppose, what the GLA's concerns are, but also what the GLA's priorities are in terms of if we could have a better seat at the table in informing what these reforms look like. So I would,
Okay.
Please continue.
Okay. Well, basically the bill proposes to introduce these national development management policies, and the current system, as you know, it requires planning applications to be determined locally with according to a development plan. And here in London, the local development plan is the London plan and local plans combined, plus any neighbourhood plans that might be relevant as well. So yes, there are national policies in place in the NPPF, but they're only a material consideration that a planning committee has to take into account. They're not actually part of the development plan. And what the bill does is to fundamentally change that relationship. It states that if there's a conflict between the NDMPs and the local plan policies, the committee or the decision maker has to decide in favour of the NDMP. It's just an absolute. So as I said, it wouldn't be possible to introduce any sort of local plans that are contrary to those NDMPs. And it's not just contrary, they could be just in advance of. So it could be going in the same direction, but you're just trying to kind of, improve upon what the NDMP actually says, and you wouldn't be able to. So if any Secretary of State just decided to introduce one on a particular subject area, it would just completely subvert the role of the local planning committee or the Mayor of London, or a combined authority planning function. So they would be elevated sort of above the development plan. And that's just going to completely lose a framework that is in place to provide sort of the requisite checks and balances, plus the local input of people as well in terms of local engagement and consultation. Because unlike development plan policies, and I think this comes to a really fundamental principle here, development plan policies, whether they're things in the London plan or whether they're ones adopted locally at local authorities, there's a clear process for consultation, independent scrutiny. A number of you on the panel today would have on the committee today would have attended the London Plan hearings that went on for months and gave a wide range of people the opportunity to question, criticise, challenge the policies that were being proposed in front of the inspector. There's no process of public consultation or scrutiny of what could be brought forward in an NDMP. They're not subject to any basic checks or processes. It is at the whim of the Secretary of State. So in the same way that this government has decided that, I don't know whether they woke up one day or it was long in the planning, but decided that scrapping the 45% tax rate would presumably have, I think they argued that it would have a very strong effect on entrepreneurialism and a boost for the economy. Well, why is it beyond the bounds of possibility that Secretary of State will wake up one day and say, actually, it will really give a big boost to housing growth if we scrapped all this nonsense about affordable housing, or at least raise the level to 50. on a site, which I understand was in the Times yesterday. I was informed because not being a Times reader, but I believe it was in the Times. So I think that is evidence of the capricious nature that a capricious approach can be adopted and end up with policies in place with far-reaching impacts that we probably sit here and try and be calm about it and think, oh, that's unlikely to happen. But actually, we're seeing this stuff happen before us. These NDMPs don't have to be capable of actual implementation. They won't have to pass any tests for that. They don't have to be consistent with any wider government policy that's in place. They don't have to take account of any regional or net zero goals. They don't have to be justified in any way. They don't have to even be capable of applying nationally. So often you have these tests that, you can't just dream up national policies just to take a particular area of the country to task. But that can happen in this case. It can be a national policy, but it doesn't. But even if it is impossible for it to be applied nationally. So, yeah, I think I've outlined a fair bit of our position and our thinking on them.
Well, particularly on the NDMP, absolutely, I couldn't agree more that it would go on to undermine the authority of local plans and the London plan. I think that is something that the committee is quite worried about in terms of...
And sorry, Chair, the one thing that I didn't say, that didn't get in, that this is all without any parliamentary scrutiny as well. The power gets put in place, and if the bill passes, and anything that the Secretary of State wants to do does not have to be scrutinised by Parliament in any way. This is what I mean about completely unfettered power and policy making.
Very concerning. Thank you, Jules. I think what we'll do is there's obviously so much to unpack in what you've already said, and I know we've got an entire section on engagement in the planning system and the effects of the reforms on this, as well as obviously wanting to talk about the infrastructure levy and so on. So the other committee members will be coming in soon to talk about that. But I'll just finish up on this final question. At this point, I'd like to bring in the other panellists, which is, in your view, what do you think the GLA's priority should be in terms of engaging with the government on planning reform? So that can be covering, I guess, your perspective on what you think the GLA's response should be to the reforms as they exist, or indeed further demands that you would want. If anyone's keen to go first, please just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm happy to start with Mita and go down the panel this way. Go for it, Mita. No pressure.
No pressure at all, thank you. In headline terms, I think I would agree with the points that Jules just made. So I suppose the National Development Management Policies is an area for focus. Just to add a little bit of context to the NDMPs and where that policy has probably come from. I mean, obviously, I'm not psychic. I can't see into the minds of ministers and civil servants. But there has long been a criticism of local plans that they contain policies which are ultimately generic and sit across the NPPF, which is the current level of national planning policy that we have at the moment, and then they get replicated in local plans. They might then, which also replicate duties which exist in legislation, for example, on heritage issues anyway. So there's a lot of repetitive, generic policies, and there has long been, I think, attempt to think about ways that we might be able to make local plans shorter, more compact, easier for people to understand. So I think the point of NDMPs was actually a response to those sorts of things that have been said on all sides of the industry and anybody that engages with the planning system, anyone that has to administer it, that is there some way of dealing with that? So it's a response to that, and I think it's difficult to argue with that as an objective, trying to pull out some of those generic policies and put them somewhere else, whether it's on heritage issues, so high-level stuff about, duties in relation to listed buildings or conservation areas, or the other area that has been mentioned is Greenbelt. I think the problem, or the problems that have come in terms of the way that the provision has come forward in the bill, are the ones that Jules has highlighted, is that they're very broad powers in relation to making in relation to making national development management policies, only a very passing reference to consultation. There is no detail on that, how it should be carried out. There are no parameters on the types of policies that might be covered by NDMPs. The power is just, I think in terms of a definition, it just talks about, policies in relation to development or use of land. That's pretty broad. And then I think the thing that was a surprise, possibly to a lot of people, was that it's given primacy over the development plan. So I think it's more about the execution rather than, if you take it back to the objective, I think that objective is still a good one. Unfortunately, I think the way it's come forward is possibly, what's raised an awful lot of concerns, including the ones that Jules has outlined. So that's my sort of headline comments on NDMPs. I think the other area is, again, Jules has highlighted it, is the infrastructure levy, which is going to complicate things massively.
Assemblyman Boff, did you want to come in?
Actually, it was just on something that Mr. Pipes said, and that was, is your concern the scrutiny of the NDMP? Because actually the relationship that the NDMP would have with London and other planning authorities is pretty much the same, is it not, as the relationship that the GLA has with boroughs with regard to the London plan, that the borough plans have to be in general conformity with the London plan. So is it just the scrutiny of the NDMP or the principle? Because if it's the principle, then we should be changing the London plan.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think the London plan fetters boroughs in the same way that MDMPs would all other planning authorities, because surely boroughs can and do go further than the London plan. It is their ability to do that. That's exactly the example that I gave, where one wouldn't be able to go further on things like climate or affordable housing than whatever was the minister's diktat, whereas we have numerous cases that we could point to in London where boroughs have gone beyond what the London plan is, because obviously London plan takes 4 or 5 years to do, and as it was in process, boroughs have seen something and said, actually, we think we can go further than that. And there are some boroughs who are, if they convince at public inspection that it hasn't fatally undermined viability, they can have a higher requirement for affordable housing than is in the London plan. I mean, we have the threshold of 35% because we have to set a threshold that works for the whole of London. That hasn't stopped one or two other boroughs adopting 40%. That would not be the case with the NDMPs. So it's both a matter of their effect being draconian, unchallengeable, and also the other thing that you said, the fact that they can be introduced with no consultation and not even any parliamentary scrutiny. It's purely on the diktat of the Secretary of State of the day.
But also, couldn't, boroughs aren't able to go for what could be described as lower standards than the London plan?
I don't think we'd have any objection. I'd have to think it through, but I don't think... Yeah, go on. Go.
I think boroughs can and boroughs have. I've previously taken through in Westminster on waste, for example, where it wasn't possible to meet the London plan. There was an outstanding general conformity issue that was maintained throughout the examination, but their core strategy was nonetheless adopted. So they can work in both directions because there is that flexibility.
Thank you. Mita, had you finished the comments that you wanted to make in terms of what you would hope the GLA's priorities would be in engaging the government on planning reforms?
Yeah, I think I'd just said the magic words infrastructure levy, which is a whole topic of conversation in itself. So I don't know.
We'll come back with
we'll
come back with further questions. No problem. Joe, did you want to...
Chair, may I just ask, are we going to have a whole section on
the
that?
infrastructure levy?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great, that's fine. Thank you.
A whole section. Joe, would you like to add anything?
Thank you very much. So my name is Joe Jeremy. I'm Director of Central London Forward, and we are a sub-regional partnership of the 12 Central London boroughs. And we work together with our member authorities and with other partners to support inclusive and sustainable growth in Central London so that our economy continues to thrive and that our residents benefit from the opportunities that creates. I think there's two things in the planning reforms, one kind of confirmed and one rumoured, which I think our members are most concerned about, and which we would kind of be keen to encourage the GLA to push in its engagement with government. The first has been covered already, the National Development Management Policies, and the second about affordable housing requirements, which has been mentioned briefly. I very much agree with all the Deputy Mayor said around the NDMPs. I think one thing I'd add is that it feels like it really jars with the rhetoric around the bill. So when it was introduced by the then Secretary of State, I think we've had two since then, but when it was introduced in May by the Secretary of State, he said in the press release that the bill would shift power out of Whitehall by giving local leaders the power they need. This is underpinned by a firm belief that by far the best placed people to level up communities are the people who live there. And I think probably all of us in this room would very much agree with that, but the NDMPs in particular very much go the other way because they have primacy over the London plan and over local plans because they're set without any consultation of people in London or anywhere else. I think it's very, very difficult to say that is a localist measure, and it's actually a kind of a significant centralisation in the planning process. I think we share the Deputy Mayor's concerns about the impact that because this is not just like a turf war about who decides what. It would have very real implications for planning in central London. We are very concerned that it would stop us from going above and beyond kind of nationally set standards. I think it would be quite difficult to set standards which are both very, very ambitious and national. There's a reason why you have local flexibility in the planning system, and that's because local circumstances are very different, and so the rules need to respond to them. Yes, it does create a little bit more kind of difficulty to navigate the system, but you need the rules to reflect local circumstances and local priorities. I think there's a couple of examples I'd give. So Westminster City Council at the moment are consulting on a retrofit first approach to development in their local plan, which would significantly reduce carbon emissions relating to redevelopment. And Camden Council require affordable housing contributions for all developments, residential developments of more than 100 square metres, so significantly below the current restrictions. So I think if we set a national standard which was a ceiling rather than a floor, then that would significantly restrict our ability to be more ambitious, to get more for our residents, more affordable housing, or to be more ambitious on net zero, let alone the impacts, which I think has already been highlighted, about discouraging people from engaging in plan setting if those plans are just set aside, if they conflict with nationally set plans. I think the second thing that we're concerned about, which, as Deputy Mayor mentioned, was reported on in the Times yesterday, is the suggested attempt to reduce the threshold for mandatory contributions to affordable housing. So at the moment, obviously, it's any development with 10 or more homes has to make some contribution to affordable housing, and the suggestion is that this would go up to 40 or even 50 homes. This would mean a very large number of developments in central London, which is a very densely kind of built-up area with few large sites. A very large proportion of developments would fall below that 40 or 50, and so would contribute potentially nothing towards the affordable and social housing which we most need in the capital. I think there's also a risk of behavioural impacts there as well. So if you look at, there's quite a few developments that you see coming forward with 9 homes. And, there's a reason why that is. I think if you lift that to 40 or 50, you will get very, very many developments coming forward with just under 50 homes, contributing nothing to the affordable and social housing that we need. The LGA recently did some analysis when this was mooted recently, which found that there'll be 30,000 fewer affordable homes delivered in the last 5 years alone. if we had increased that threshold from 10 to 40 or 50. So I think those are the two concerns, the kind of primacy of NDMPs, which actively goes against the supposed kind of localist impulse of the bill, and the potential increase in the threshold for affordable housing.
Thank you, Joe. That was very helpful. I particularly liked your phrase, a ceiling rather than a floor in terms of standards. I think that really put it into perspective. Angela, it would be great to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm here today on behalf of Neighbourhood Planners London, and I also have a lot of sort of work done and sort of working as a consultant with a lot of community groups. So my angle will really be sort of the third, in fact, the fourth tier of the planning system, and looking upwards in that sense. And that's where obviously the national development management plans come in quite strongly. And from this fourth tier of planning, I think there might be even some merit in bringing a bit more consistency into the planning system, because if you work on neighbourhood plan environments where, for instance, you have two boroughs, you're working with two local plans, and then you have the London plan above you, it is sometimes very, very challenging to explain to residents and businesses why the things they read in the neighbourhood, in the national planning framework, why that doesn't apply to their neighbourhood area, and how that then sort of sits together. So the architecture, the legal architecture of planning is incredibly complex. And I think this bill will make this more complex as it is. There's a great lack of detail, and speculation is ripe, basically, in all this uncertainty. So I think in terms of I think that for the GLA to work with the government on more of the detail of this, in terms of what then the regulations would say, would be very helpful. Specifically, probably around how affordable housing will be secured through the infrastructure levy, so what implications that might have, because that's very, very close to every Londoners and all the people we work with, to their agendas, why they're doing neighbourhood planning and why they're involved in the fourth tier. And then another aspect where I think consistency could be probably welcome is around green space protection. So again, I think I'm a bit more of a meta here, where probably there could be merit in looking at national development management plans if they address very, very broad themes and issues that are of concern to many people, like green space protection, affordable housing provision, and perhaps also the whole energy strategy, where we find that we have a very great issue in front of us, but we don't really have a consistent approach across the various local authorities, across the various agencies. And the bill also, in fact, actually strengthens neighbourhood planning in a very positive way, we would say. There is probably work that could be done where the GLA could help us to further strengthen neighbourhood planning as the fourth tier, and then deliver on some of these key missions around the Levelling Up bill. And neighbourhood priority statements are sort of one new tool that are suggested. It's quite unclear how they will operate, particularly looking at the various timeframes, because they're supposed to sit under the local plan. How that interacts with the London plan is not really explained, but also what would happen if a local plan doesn't get updated every 5 years, and we know that's often an issue with timescales. Where would these neighbourhood priority statements then sit? So this sort of the architecture of this and how it sits on a timeline, and how you would fill the gaps and the delays, I think would be a really important aspect of looking at this bill from our point of view.
That's really helpful, Angela. Thank you for sharing that. And Deneen, finally, before I think I'll be passing over to the committee members soon after that. Yeah. Shall I bring Deneen in first, and then? Yeah. Go for it.
Thank you, Chair. As you've already said, my name is Deneen Rowe. I'm a project manager for the Town and Country Planning Association.
Deneen, can I just ask you to bring your microphone a little closer to you? Perfect. Thank you.
So yes, my name is Deneen Rowe. I'm the project manager for Planning Aid for London in partnership with the Town and Country Planning Association. Planning Aid for London is a free planning advice service to Londoners. We give free planning advice to disadvantaged communities and people who feel that they are left out of the planning system, as well as offering free workshops and so on. So I think that sort of goes without saying that my main concern on this would be the lack of opportunities for residents to let their voices be known, which has been a long-standing issue with the planning system. I think having looked through this, it implies that having public engagement in various forms is a main hindrance to developments in house building. And I think I would hope that other people would agree with me that is absolutely not the case. I've also noticed that the government has stressed opportunities of digitising planning data. I think having that information in a digital format would be helpful, but just because that implies that something being online is automatically accessible, automatically understandable, and something that people across the board will want to engage in, and that's simply not the case. There are various groups that would be left out because of that. I think in terms of how people engage with the planning system, it might be different for other people, but with Planning Aid for London, one of the biggest gaps or hurdles that we have to get over is getting residents to feel empowered to engage with their local plans or their neighbourhood plans. There are many people who feel that they have strong voices and feelings about their local area, but their first port of communication, so local councillors or council leaders, might not necessarily take their opinions to account, or they might not necessarily be listened to. I cannot imagine speaking to residents who would somehow feel better about that now being the Secretary of State. Unless I'm wrong. I'm not. So, yeah, I think those are the main points for me, and I know we'll come back on the infrastructure levy as well.
That's fantastic, Janine. Thank you. Assemblyman Berry, did you want to come in?
Yes. Pardon me. I just wanted to go back to Deputy Mayor, because one of the questions we put to you at the beginning was how are you engaging with the government during the passage of the bill? And arguably, I think you are London's voice on this. We all have voices as well. I know that we'll engage with our MPs and our Lords, and the various nature groups have made a very strong statement about how they're going to engage about all of this. I'm sure that the different guests that we have also will be expressing their voices in how they deal with changing what is put before Parliament in the end. But you, as the Deputy Mayor for Regeneration Planning at a London level, potentially ought to be mustering London MPs behind this, working closely with London councils. I know that Joe mentioned some data. I think the LGA's put together, getting all that together, making sure that we've got access to it. Are you doing that kind of work to campaign on this bill, given its obvious failings?
Yes, I mean, the campaigning element, for what it's worth, I'm not sure really the government's interested in campaigns or listening to them, but certainly the boroughs we've been working closely with them, and we've all made our opinion clear. The government is in, and certainly civil servants are in, no doubt as to what the Mayor thinks, what I think, what boroughs think. I think on a more constructive, perhaps, note, that obviously GLA officials working under the Mayor's direction have been engaging with officials within DLUC, and also with MPs in particular. We've been working with MPs that are on the committee to encourage changes to the bill, and by and large they're all rejected. I mean, a case in point are the ones about the unfettered nature of the NDMP power, and limiting it in some of the ways that have been suggested, whether it's solely to say green belt or heritage or whatever, and those kind of ideas have been proposed, but they've been firmly rebuffed. So it's the government's preference that it's a kind of a completely blank sheet as to what the Secretary of State can implement. As I say, I mean, one could draw up enough limits to actually make something like this acceptable. It's possible. I'm not ruling it out. It would be convoluted, but maybe you could. You could say limit it to only greenbelt, only heritage, for example. But is it a ceiling? or is it a minimum? And if it's a minimum, then fine. But actually, at the moment, as I've said earlier, it's an absolute. So if there's a policy on it, you don't have a policy locally. It's not just about an argument, is it higher or lower? You just don't have a policy. And I mean, that's why I think I'd strongly take issue with the neighbourhood planning issue. I don't want to see national planning policies like this unless they are of the highest possible standard, and as the facts and science changes, people can trial higher yet standards. Surely that's where we want to go to. What I don't want is a national uniform standard that is probably already not benchmark, as is currently the case. The national benchmark on CO2 is lower than where we are now, although they have recently raised it. I think I'm right. I'm at least saying that they've raised it recently, but it's still not as high as in the London plan. I'm sure eventually they'll end up matching the London plan. I think they just caught up to the previous London plan is what they did. So this is my point about being in the vanguard with the right policies, and then nationally them catching up. But also the point that was made earlier by another panellist, that sometimes it's difficult to have uniform policies. They're just not appropriate to apply uniformly across the country. So as I say, I'm all up for minimum standards if they're minimums, and one is at liberty to go beyond them. But that isn't what this policy is about. National policy is about.
Can I just go back to my original question again?
Go for it.
That was a lot of that was responses to what the guest said rather than the question specifically about.
I thought I'd answered your question about who we had worked with.
You did, but I had a follow up and then you moved on. Are you going to continue to try to put amendments, and are you trying to work closely with London MPs on this? And in which case, are they going to include amendments such as, I mean, from what you were just saying, one of them might be to, you've got the MPPF for making a broad policy that then can be exceeded. Or, there is already a functioning system. So you might make changes that just sort of put it into the MPPF instead of create a whole new layer. That could be. I know you say that sort of thing's been rebuffed, but you could build a consensus and a strong campaign around that. And then the other option potentially is to exclude London. Are you thinking about that? And that's very parochial of us, but potentially because we have that additional layer of planning, you might try to make it not apply.
Well, sometimes it's been a bit vague as to what will apply and what won't apply to London. But at the moment,
I'm aware of that, yeah.
Yeah, at the moment, we're working on the basis that it will apply. But, I mean, the committee stage is now done, and the next hurdle, obviously, is going to be the Lords. So we'll be looking to work with the Lords to achieve what we haven't achieved. And so when I say we, it's not just the GLA, it's many others in the country and London boroughs and so on. So that's the next step.
I'm going to move us on to investment zones now, because we've got still quite a lot of questions to get through. But just to finish up on that point that Senator Berry was making, I think it's quite clear that the committee would be very willing to work with you in terms of how we can further influence the bill at the stage of the Lords, but it seems to be rapidly changing, so as changes happen.
And sorry, I should say that it's by no means certain what bits of the current bill are actually going to be taken forward by the latest iteration of the government.
Exactly. So let's keep talking. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Best now to begin us on investment zones.
I'm not sure. I can dig it out. So it was the LGA analysis, which looked back 5 years and worked out what the loss. Sorry, my thing went off. Worked out what the loss in affordable housing contributions would have been if there'd been a higher cap. But I will dig it out.
So that would have been over 5 years, not over a year. Okay, I took you as a year, and that's why I was a bit thrown by that. Okay, Mita. Just wanted to come back to you quickly, because I think you raised this really importantly. The reason behind this, where we see only 39% of councils have got the local plans in place, and perhaps the initial, where I think we all thought initially that this sat was that we were going to get some kind of designated standards around obvious things around. We've mentioned green space, heritage. Are there any obvious ones which we would say, okay, that's a good idea to have a national standard?
That's a good question. I must admit I haven't thought beyond the obvious things around heritage and Greenbelt, because they are the sorts of things that you can see would be something that would be applicable nationally, not least because in terms of that objective of trying to simplify local plans, those are the ones that are most commonly just rehearsed again and again and again. And I think, I think the point was just made. We do have national policy. It's in the form of the National Planning Policy Framework. So we know that we can have some policies in areas which...
Sorry, Nita, that was
sorry. So we know that we have areas where, where you can devise policies which are at a significantly strategic level, because that's the point, it's significantly strategic level that can apply across a broad range of areas. So perhaps, looking at the MPPF and what that covers might be another way of kind of trying to think about some areas that might be susceptible to NDMPs in a way that actually the objective was intended to apply, I think. And I do think the objective is a good one. It is. I think the problem is in the execution, it's just far too broad. And if, I think it's disappointing actually to hear that, those points have been made already and perhaps the government isn't listening to those concerns.
Thanks, Nisa. That's really helpful. And I will move on to investment zones now, Chair. Jules, the GLA is one of 38 local authorities that recently announced to be in discussions with the government on investment zones. What have those discussions involved, and how and when will the GLA engage with Londoners on those proposals?
Yeah, the Mayor's Office has been in discussion, and obviously officials from the GLA have been in discussion with DLUC on the requirements that have been laid out for investment zones to see whether there are any appropriate sites in London. The GLA is having discussions with boroughs that have expressed an interest in having an investment zone within their boundary. The total number is in single figures within London, and unfortunately there isn't a process, a public process that's applicable in this instance, as the government expects these expressions of interest to be made in 2 days' time, this Friday. They have to be put in. So a fortnight does not allow, in fact it's less than a fortnight. I think they were still giving out regulations last weekend. So that it's not feasible to actually have a process. Obviously, they're democratically elected boroughs. The mayor is democratically elected. There is that element of opinion and local input into it. And also, I think more importantly than that, that it's unlikely that these projects, well, say it another way, any projects that do come forward are ones that will be subject to proper process. Either they're existing projects that have planning permissions in place, or if they don't, they will have to go through the planning process, which obviously will involve, well, unless all the government legislation comes to pass, assuming current legislation applies, there will be a public process for whatever the proposals are that are brought forward.
Thanks. Could you say more about where those areas in London are, and has that conversation been more boroughs approaching, or maybe a consortium of boroughs approaching you, or you and the mayoral team approaching boroughs and saying you think it's a good fit, or a mixture of both perhaps?
I think it's been a mixture of both, perhaps, in my opinion, more boroughs expressing an interest, but the boroughs that have expressed an interest has sometimes coincided with the what the GLA view are of likely areas. I think they. I'm not at liberty to say, because obviously we're not. We're only half of the equation, and I don't know whether the boroughs involved would be happy for it to be discussed at this point and then fail, and then it be known that they were pitching for it and didn't get supported. So I can understand why So I hope you can understand why I'm not at liberty to really to say where they are. But as I say, single figures, and I don't think they would surprise you where they are. They're the kind of places, places that we talk about all the time, that perhaps stalled and need the fillip of extra resources.
Thanks. Yeah, no, completely understand that, but a girl can try, right? How similar will the investment zones be to opportunity areas?
I think completely different in the sense that, well, in many senses, but I mean, opportunity areas really are only that, identifying where there is an opportunity for growth. Unfortunately, they're not funded. The closest to funding that they get is working out what the funding shortfall is by identifying the infrastructure needs that would unlock opportunity areas. One would hope that investment zones will come with something that actually unlocks stalled sites or projects that need a significant infrastructure investment, or are only viable if there was a particular tax break, such as the TIF, the TIF system. Something meaningful where a sizable amount of the business rates, for example, could be retained for a period, as is being discussed with investment zones. So yeah, I think the key difference is one is a planning tool, and one would hope that infrastructure zones is a kind of an implementation tool that will bring resources.
Thanks. And the second part of the question I was going to ask was about whether Londoners would have an opportunity to be involved prior to the designation, but I think you answered that earlier, that it would be after the fact of designation there would be the consult. Mita, if I could come back to you, if that's okay, to ask how different are the investment zones to the previous growth area proposals which appeared in the 2020 planning white paper and then were dropped because they were controversial?
That's a really good exam question, which I probably can't answer that with any degree of specificity, probably. I mean, coming back to the proposals that there are at the moment in relation to investment zones, I think that so far what's been clear is that they're going to involve significant tax breaks. So I think what I've read about that so far is rates, business rates, capital allowances, employer NI, contributions. So some quite specific relaxations for periods of time on those types of taxes for businesses or developers moving into investment zones. The other part of it is obviously the planning relaxation, and there isn't any detail on that yet. So growth zones were again about the planning relaxations. I think investment zones are very much more, there's some really specific proposals already about the tax breaks that you will get. I am not a tax consultant.
No, sorry, that was a bit of an exam question, wasn't it? But you passed, I think, so well done. Sorry. Sorry about that. Deneen, if I could come to you, please, and just ask, in 2020, the previous Planning and Regeneration Committee responded to the planning white paper, making clear it didn't support the idea of automatic permissions, as that undermines community engagement and the local democratic process. So what do you believe that this effect to streamline the planning process within the investment zones that we've just been talking about would have on that public consultation?
I think as sort of Jules mentioned, if things are streamlined, that doesn't really allow for the originality that each borough holds and the sort of individual pride and heritage that each borough has. It just doesn't allow room for that, and it could be quite disheartening, I think. If residents feel that there is a standard or rules or a plan that everybody is working to, it makes it very difficult to then persuade people that their voice can actually make a change.
I say it come back, doesn't it, to the initial investment zones. So how stringent really does the engagement have to be, and how can those, when those come about, the consultation process be so clear and so open to residents that they do feel like they've shaped what's happening afterwards, if that makes sense.
Sorry, could you...
Because it's so that, like I say, that if it's going to be streamlined within that first proposal of,
Yeah.
so the consultation, almost the big consultation, comes from that first investment zone being put in and what planning looks like in there. So how is it best to engage people in that? To give a specific example, people can be quite angry at one proposal they see coming in their local area. They don't often see that comes from the local plan, which is a big beast, right? So how can we, this is a similar example of that, how do we get people to engage in those investment zones and the importance of contributing to what they should look like?
I think one thing we need to remember at the heart of it is that community engagement should be a consistent thing during big plans for a local area. There is no sort of one and done or a couple of consultations and everything is sorted. As there are different stages of each project, I think that then brings about a new opportunity for people to engage. I can't really see a way for you to ring fence that and have that be successful.
So, Bess, could I come in on this topic if you're finished with your questions?
Yeah. I was just going to say one more clarification. I think for us to take away is that there's something around how you fit that in to the process that perhaps we take away as a recommendation around constant reviewing of investment zones to make sure that residents are heard. That's all.
No, brilliant, thank you. And I think I just wanted to take a small step back and maybe bring Jules and Jo in, which is, do you have any concerns around the investment zones proposals and the impact on, we've talked about it with community engagement, but also how we develop our local boroughs? Jules, if I start with you and then bring you in, Jo.
I'm just being careful because, you know, obviously these submissions are going in on Friday. But one of the things that obviously has been raised about investment zones is that, as well as tax breaks, there would be a deregulation of planning. And you're required to indicate whether you would support the deregulation of planning on the investment zones. And the Mayor and the GLA aren't prepared to tick that box. It's not a fail, it's not a pass or fail test for the bid. But it will be interesting to see what their reaction is.
Thank you. Jo.
Thanks. And just to respond briefly to Emma's question about local authority involvement. So, because we've been involved a little bit in engaging with the GLA on this, and I've got to say the timetable they were given was pretty frightening. It was really, really short. But I think they've done really well at engaging boroughs. So we had a cross-London call with GLA colleagues and London councils and chief execs of most London boroughs on the day they were announced. And GLA have both put forward a number of sites which they were potentially interested in, reported the sites which government are potentially interested in, and offered boroughs the opportunity to suggest their sites as well. And they've also said that no site will be put forward without the approval of the local authorities covered. So I think they've done a very good job at engaging with local authorities given the timetable. The ability to engage with communities given the timetable is virtually impossible. So I think that is a bit of a concern about investment zones. The kind of breakneck speed at which they're going at means that actually the ability to consult with local communities is very limited. In terms of your point, Emma, about kind of the how do we engage communities in terms of the planning implications, I don't think that's the intended kind of. I think a big part of investment zones is actually a view that the planning regime is a primary barrier to growth, and so actually what it's about is getting that out of the way. And my concern is that the tax incentives won't really be offered unless areas agree to the planning deregulations. I think there's a lot of areas in London that could hugely benefit from the kind of tax incentive side. My concern is that the government will see the planning deregulation as a quid pro quo and won't allow kind of investment zones to go forward without those. I think my other concerns around, well, I don't want to focus on too much on concerns. I think, firstly, to say it's really welcome that the government approached London to discuss a potential investment zone or investment zones in the capital. I don't think that could have been taken for granted a few months ago, but I think it does show that there's a kind of renewed interest from the government in supporting London to grow and a recognition that that benefits the whole of the UK. That's great. I think my other concern about investment zones, beyond the sort of kind of challenges around community engagement, which you highlighted, Emma, is just the effectiveness of them. So much of the evidence around these sort of area-based kind of regeneration policies that rely on tax incentives and planning deregulation is pretty sketchy, and it suggests that much of the jobs growth that you do see within those areas is displacement rather than additional job creation. So if we designate an investment zone in London, I'm sure we'll probably see pretty decent jobs growth in that area. The challenge is much of that will come at the expense of other parts of London and the South East. So I'm sceptical about the extent to which it will have additionality. And there's risks in those policies because economic activity happens where it does, often for a reason. So if you put in place policies that artificially divert economic activity to other areas, whilst it can benefit that area, the kind of net impact, it doesn't necessarily lead to an efficient economy and to growth that can be widely shared. I think my final concern about the investment zone policy is it sees the role of the state as getting out of the way, whereas actually the role of the state and the role of local government in regeneration is really, really important as a partner rather than as a sort of bystander. So actually a lot of the examples that the government have given, King's Cross, Canary Wharf, had an absolutely crucial role for public sector investment and public sector engagement alongside the private sector in priming the development and in levering in private sector investment. And the same is true of developments outside of the capital, for example, in Salford with the media city there. So, and the best thing that I think government could do to drive growth in London is not necessarily one or two investment zones, but is to look at the infrastructure that could really unlock housing and jobs growth in the capital. So the Bakerloo line, for example, which the extension would mean 100,000 additional homes in the capital and 130,000 additional jobs, or Crossrail 2, which will be 200,000 homes and 150 billion to the UK economy. So it's that sort of infrastructure investment which is proven to deliver additional growth rather than kind of the state getting out of the way and creating little pockets which may suck in jobs but doesn't necessarily lead to huge additionality.
That's really helpful, Joe. Thank you, Jules. You look like you want to come back in.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with absolutely every word that Joe said. I'd add two quick things. When he was going through the process at the beginning, it reminded me that one of the that there's a requirement to get the local MP to agree as well. So their endorsement has to be secured for each of the investment zones. And Joe gave the example of the Bakerloo line, because I was thinking actually, if I had to give an example that wasn't one of the actual cases that we're taking forward, what would I alight on? And that was going to be one that I was going to use and say it would be great to be able to have an investment zone that threw up enough money to get that done. But sadly, I think that the investment zones aren't going to be as effective as the tools that we used for the the Northern Line extension, Vauxhall and Nine Elms, because a lot of the business rates there is corralled to help paying for that, as well as other funding streams. Whereas the investment zone seems very much that it's just an uplift above a notional treasury trajectory. So it's not a winner takes all, blank site, businesses come in, they get to keep, you get to keep all the business rates. It's more a case of, well, had there been no investment zone, there is a notional, amount of development that would have taken place and thrown up a notional amount of business rates, and what you get to keep is what you have actually achieved above what the Treasury thinks you might have achieved had there been no investment zone, and that could be quite a marginal amount of uplift.
Thank you. I think we're going to be moving on to Assemblyman Berry to start talking to us about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. But just before I pass over, are you conveying these concerns around investment zones to the government, Jules?
I mean, in our discussions as they go on, obviously we are articulating it to a degree, but at the moment it's a case of, in a very short period of time, the government has made an offer that we'll interact with at, on trust that there is a deal to be made here. So we're not going to. It's not like what we were talking about earlier with the planning, with the plan, with the levelling up bill. We need to travel down a bit of a road here with the government on these to discover, I mean, how many days has this been live? And the discussions about whether we wanted to be part of it started immediately. It's not really a kind of a lobbying, campaigning kind of situation.
No,
it's more of an engagement and discussion. Is there a deal to be done here on these zones in London? And so so whether it's a good thing or a bad thing will be teased out in those discussions.
Yeah, I guess two things to clearly flag that have come from both the panel and also I think yourself, which is the aspect of deregulating planning as a potential requirement, and also the lack of community engagement around investment zones and the capacity for it. So I would hope that those are concerns that are taken forward because they're quite significant.
Yes.
Angela, and then I'll bring in Assemblymember Berry.
Thank you, Chair. With regards to the investment zones, obviously I don't know where they are, and we can't, get that knowledge today. But it is worth then reminding the government probably to check where there are neighbourhood plan and forums in place to see how that then gels with the localism agenda and the investment agenda, because the government does recognise neighbourhood planning as an important tool. Obviously, not engaging local people and businesses in these decisions goes completely against the general localism agenda. And on maybe as a second point, some of these groups have been working for years on their draft plans, Regulation 14, Regulation 16 plans, and obviously now bringing investment zones in sideways and very rapidly will completely change the environment. And the working and the policy will comply. So I like that also be highlighted as a real issue.
That's really helpful, thank you. Assemblyman Berry, and just to highlight, after this small section, we'll be having a 5-minute comfort break.
Excellent, I approve of those a lot. So, my question is about the announcement in August that they're also going to bring forwards a new planning and infrastructure bill to essentially further try to streamline the planning process for major infrastructure projects. Now, I know these don't cover, there aren't many of those in London so far. I think the list in my head, and I'm trying to find a list by region, but I think the list in my head is Silvertown Tunnel, Edmonton Incinerator, there's an oil pipeline, interestingly, and bits of the M25. These are the only things that really have been done in London. But we already know that process that was brought in from 2008, the Planning Act then, significantly reduced the ability of communities to have an impact on these plans, these major infrastructure plans. And so to be further doing that and calling the limited engagement that communities can have with these projects a burden or something that needs to be streamlined seems wrong to me. And I just wondered if you would agree with the Chancellor on this or with me. And that question is obviously to Jules. Sorry, I should have said so at the beginning.
Yeah, I think this is getting into an area probably outside of my my general knowledge.
Well, I was hoping you might be able to comment therefore, because often we ask you questions that
I agree with the thrust of where you're going on this, but I mean I don't want to kind of arbitrarily condemn the whole totality of some of the changes, because I understand that. I mean, for example, if we're talking about some of the changes about development consent order, and or whether we're talking about sort of environmental impact protection.
I'll come on to the environmental part, but I was specifically talking about the process and the fact they want to curtail it even further, even though it's supposed to already be a streamlined process compared to the old one.
The criticism was implicit in your question, and I can only agree with that. Is that sufficient comment?
No, that's really useful. I mean, there was considerable discussion about this when they tried to put fracking into define fracking projects as nationally significant infrastructure, which they currently were not, because they were slightly too small scale for it. And a lot of MPs and the committee at the time in Parliament was commenting that this was almost blatantly an example of trying to curtail public debate on fracking because local authorities had been turning projects down. And I think you, as the planning authority for London, you wouldn't particularly want, I don't think, to have large-ish projects that you currently have jurisdiction over taken out of your hands.
Yep, absolutely agree.
Great, okay, thank you very much. Again, we have no particular details of exactly what they're going to do there.
As you say, they're quite rare for London, so it's not something that I kind of like...
At the current scale, they are. Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to ask Deneen, who obviously you do represent local communities. I don't know if you've been involved in any of the projects that I mentioned that are under this regime, or whether you'd want to be part of that regime for some of the larger planning projects that you support people to get involved in.
We have not been engaged in any of those projects, and would definitely welcome the opportunity to engage communities and to give them a better understanding of that and ways to get involved. Absolutely.
Okay, and thank you. It's not a hard question, so yes, it's great. And Joe, I think you're probably someone else who, again, represents parts of London where potentially the authorities value their ability to have their own say over larger projects. Is that something that you'd welcome, the proposals that seem to be coming forward?
I think it's difficult to say until we kind of see the full detail on the proposals. I think we obviously need to ensure that we strike the right balance between supporting important infrastructure projects to come forward, including infrastructure that can support our transition to net zero, and the environmental impacts of that infrastructure, and obviously kind of community involvement. I've got to say, some of the most important infrastructure kind of projects in central London, which we are kind of most keen to see, aren't necessarily being held back by planning issues that are the kind of so-called sclerotic kind of planning system, but by funding. So most obviously the Bakerloo line extension again is, which I will bang on about endlessly until it actually happens. That is massively supported by the Mayor of London, and it's a priority for TfL, but it's undeliverable at the moment given the kind of funding situation that TfL faces. So I think we'll wait to see what the actual proposals are in the planning bill, but I think in terms of getting the infrastructure that we need delivered in central London, it's not necessarily the planning system, it's the ability to fund them that is the barrier holding things back.
Okay, I wonder if I could ask Lisa, as the planning expert on the team, can you see what coming forwards in London there might be under that regime? Because I think Bakerloo line extension potentially might do.
To be honest, we haven't looked in a huge amount of detail, and the reason for that is the planning and infrastructure bill is just at such an embryonic stage, and it's a single.
Sorry, I meant under the current system, would Bakerloo line extension be an NSIP or not?
I'd have to check.
I'm not
sure.
know.
I mean, the only ones I know, Thames Tideway Tunnel, Crossrail, HS2 and Heathrow, are the ones that I know have come through the NSIP process. And I don't even think, things like City Airport, I don't even think have come through that process, but I'd have to check.
Not the things they've done so far, no.
That's right. So I'm not entirely sure, my apologies.
Okay, so yes, one of the things it wants to do is, they say in the press release they want to do is cut the timescale for it. And that's an interesting one because the timescale for it already is quite curtailed. You are, once you're involved as a member, I've been involved in this quite a lot. Once you're involved as a member of the community, the deadlines are thick and fast for responding to a huge amount of information. And I think they have switched the burden over to communities in the system already. And if it gets any faster, I very much doubt whether a community grassroots group could cope. But we will see. So the final aspect of the press release, effectively, that was put out about this, is that they also want to, apart from timing, streamline, they say, and reduce the burden of environmental assessments, and in a wider sense, reform habitats and species regulations. Now, that's a huge thing, and that has provoked quite an extraordinary backlash from the environmental charities already. I want to check in with you, Jules, what you've been doing so far on this and what your plans are for potentially joining what may be an enormous campaign on this, I think.
I don't think we'll be having to join it. I think the Mayor is already firmly there. I mean, he's made his commitment, long-standing commitment, very clear on climate change, halting and reversing the decline in biodiversity, reducing pollution, facilitating, a rapid transition to net zero by 2030. So I think the Mayor is firmly, in a leadership position on that. Why I was equivocating earlier on your question was because to be honest, I'd lost track between bills. It was the Levelling Up bill that actually was relatively benign on this, and we were quite okay on the fact that it seemed to indicate that there would be effectively almost a rollover of the EU approach to environmental outcome assessments. And it's with the Planning and Infrastructure bill where, and you used the right word, they describe it as a burden. And they're burdens, these environmental regulations are burdens to be overcome rather than something that's vital, and necessary to preserve, enhance, make the environment a better place for us all to live in. And so that is a worry. So I think I can assure you that the Mayor will be there alongside everybody else complaining about us.
Excellent. If you add up the membership of the different groups that have already spoken out on this, and then add to that 8.5 million Londoners, that's a very large coalition of people that might be able to maintain our current systems of protection if they do go ahead with specific proposals. Can I check, though, because a lot of the regulations are things that, like you said, they came from the EU, and they're kind of implied rather than stated within our own planning policies. To what extent, in a similar way to the process we talked about earlier, if the government switches those off, will we need to change the London plan to match them, and can we resist at that stage, as it were, or is it an instant switch and therefore suddenly those things just do not apply?
I'd be guessing if I said I think it's different, because I think the London plan would keep us covered if it just wasn't absence. But I'm going to hand over to Lisa.
I was going to say that depending on how it was done, I think if they all got switched off, and I think we're away from that because it involves changes to primary legislation, but it would be a bit like bringing in the use class E, where it was brought in and there are just some parts of the London plan that just don't make sense anymore because they refer to old use classes that got absorbed into use class E, and I think it would be very similar. It'll obviously dictate how we move forward with a new London plan if things like sustainability appraisal, habitat regulation assessment were removed, but it also just leaves the London plan out of date in those areas.
Can I perhaps help?
Yes, of course, yes.
I didn't
Yeah.
introduce myself at the beginning, and then tell you what I do, which might have been helpful to you from the outset. I'm actually I started life as a local authority planner, but I'm a planning lawyer. So yeah, you might find that helpful. In terms of the the environmental impact regulations, the habitats and species regulations, and I think also SEA. I think the issue about the planning infrastructure bill that's been announced is it talks about, you know, streamlining all of these regulations. Ultimately, that's already being done through the LURB, or that was the proposal. That's why, you know, the LURB talks about having environmental outcomes reports, etc. And again, a good objective, trying to streamline all of these different regimes and bring them into line with each other, because I think that has caused problems in the past. So what we don't know, I think, in terms of what's been said already, is whether the intention is to continue with the reforms that are already proposed under the LURB, and that's what they mean by, you know, streamlining those sorts of regulations, or it does actually mean going further than that. In terms of the LURB at the moment, there is a clause in effect, a non-regression clause, which says we're not going to go, you know, to standards lower than the EU ones. So at the moment, I think that it's still a question as to whether, you know, this new bill will go further in terms of trying to roll things back. Even if the legislation were to change, the policy is the policy. If you've got London plan policy, any local plan policy, that's still part of the development plan. In terms of the way that it's expressed, I don't think it, you know, says in line with the EIA regulations or whatever, i.e. referring back to legislation specifically. It will just be policy around setting standards for various things. And ultimately, you know, the existing legislation on EIA, HRA, all the rest of it, what that does is require that assessments are done and put in front of local authorities when decisions are made around planning permissions, and ensures that, you know, local authorities have had that information in front of them when they've made their decisions. It doesn't prescribe in any way the decision they must make as a result of it. They will still be looking at planning policy that is in place. So changes to legislation won't necessarily have an impact immediately on planning policy. That will still be adopted policy, and they will still form part of the development plan.
Okay, that's really helpful. Obviously, there's two aspects here. There's the process of assessment, and then there's the actual rules and regulations, and they're talking about changing both. Thank you very much, though. That really does help clarify. Thank you. That's the end of me.
Thank you. We will be coming back after a 5-minute adjournment to discuss the infrastructure levy, the impact on the Mayor's planning powers, compulsory purchase powers, God, that was a mouthful, and community involvement in planning. So if I could have guests back and those who are on the webcast by 3:23, that would be grand. We're adjourned for 5 minutes. And welcome back to the GLA Planning and Regeneration Committee. I hope everyone had a comfortable comfort break. I know we're missing one of our committee members and one of our guests, but I am going to crack us on because we've got a lot of business still to get through. We are due to finish at 4:30, and I understand you have to leave it exactly then, Jules, and if we do run over, we'll be... And so does Lisa. We'll be happy, of course, to excuse you, but there might be some questions remaining. We'll see how we get on. Okay, we're moving on to the community involvement in planning section, and I'm going to pass over to Assemblymember Buff for this.
Hi, I'm addressing this to Ms. Koch. The government had previously said that with the Levelling Up Bill, it aims to improve the planning process so that it gives local communities control over what is built, where it is built, and what it looks like. How does this aim square with the more recent announcements around investment zones and the new Planning and Infrastructure Bill, both of which aim to streamline and shorten the planning processes?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
No, I mean, but it's also a relatively old problem because the announcement over the last nearly a decade around neighbourhood planning, localism, don't really fit very well with permitted development rights. In a way, the planning aspect of the investment zones, just for, it might use a different term or different name, but it is permitted development. And that obviously doesn't sit well with, let's say, the social structures that have been built in London around neighbourhood planning, about how people informally organise themselves and work on planning policies, try to explain the system and the system changes to neighbours, to people that are, will be impacted by it. And it's incredibly, I think, disrespectful is a term to be used, because the messaging, the headline messages that sound all perfect and right, but the actual follow through in terms of process and the detail and in fact the impact are not delivering on it yet. And that's true for, I mean, from that fourth layer on the planning, neighbourhood planning, that is true for often local plan policies, that's often true for London plan policies, and also for the layer above, even now, before we have these changes coming. What actually does happen often in neighbourhood planning is that we pinch London plan policies because they're much more progressive in many ways than the local authority plan policies. And we then often get told you can't do that because you have to be in general conformity with the local plan and so on. And you have all these battles, and that's individuals in the forums. I can't quite envisage what the reaction will be if we had 8 or 9 investment zones across London. Because neighbourhood planning groups are hundreds and thousands of people, on email lists talking to each other. And I do think that there probably should be and will be quite a loud response if these investment zones coming in places that people feel there shouldn't be, or they feel overwhelmed by them.
So you're saying that the Levelling Up Bill and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill are contradicting each other? Those two objectives are contradicting each other?
I don't really think I understand the infrastructure bill completely, and I don't really think I understand fully what the Levelling Up Bill really wants to achieve, because there isn't much detail in it. Right. I do think, when I said earlier that the national development management policies could be something positive if it's done properly, around affordable housing, around empty properties, around green spaces, about urban greening factor. Because obviously in London we have an urban greening factor in a policy, and the rest of the country we don't, and some people don't even have a local plan. Or around place-based provision, things that we know are generally right and should be pursued through planning, and to bring a balance around private and public interest, provide a framework. And so I see benefits in the Levelling Up Bill if it's done properly, but I can't say yes or no because it hasn't been defined, and I'm not involved in this sort of detailed discussions on government level what they really want to achieve with it.
So do you think, with paying sufficient attention to both objectives, both in the Levelling Up Bill and the Planning Infrastructure, do you think there's a compromise that the government could come to on the Planning Infrastructure Bill?
I think seeing quite a lot of these very bold movements in terms of policies and being quite radical, I think what I probably miss is being radical about engagement and radical about actual delivering proper involvement and co-production, and facing some of the very, very difficult issues. As I said, there's a long tradition in doing consultation in London, in other local areas, but very little impact of it. And I think people, in particular in the neighbourhood planning scene, some of that motivation to engage with all this loads of work and taking all that responsibility is about that hope that they can actually deliver a positive impact for their communities. And I think developing a process as part of this, the policy around investment zones, around levelling up, around infrastructure levy, that allows the communities to be part of it, at least understand, and then actually shaping it, that'd be fantastic. Will it happen? I don't think so. It's just the pace these projects are so being pushed forward are just not very conducive to engaging with a number of people, never mind on residents and businesses, basically.
Okay. And so if these investment zones, as a part of the process of developing the actual legislation, were to be instructed to take into account local plans, would that help?
I think it would certainly help. It would certainly help. The question is the local plans as they are now, or the local plans that are supposed to be produced within that 5-year horizon.
Right.
Because local plans across London are in very different stages. Some of them are 5-6 years old and are sort of nearly could be considered out of date, and others are a year old.
Is it fair to say that the government's aspirations is to simplify those plans, which is another example of the government following the London Assembly, may I say, because when we did investigations into neighbourhood plans, the recommendation was that they are sometimes too difficult for residents to compile and needed simplification. So if combined with that simplifying, community statements, neighbourhood statements of intent, do you think that's a way forward?
Probably two parts. Neighbourhood planning in London has not received any of the support from the GLA or the mayor in the last decade. And you at the last meeting, committee meeting, identified that there is a particular need to address the London-specific challenges of neighbourhood forums to be supported, and that has not happened. In addition, the funding arrangements from government, which were in a way quite generous until 2018, that has completely changed. So you also sort of the resource end from the government level was reduced. I think it's like £18,000 that groups can now sort of access for direct support. So I think we haven't tried hard enough to make this work really well. On the other hand, we have still 70 groups across London working. We have now 26 adopted neighbourhood plans. Tomorrow is a referendum in a Roman road as well. And we have a lot of neighbourhood groups are stuck because they have not enough funding, not enough support. And I do think sort of from the fourth tier, we're struggling often with the third tier, with the local authorities. And you might be aware all versions of battles that are run. But we also, particularly, some groups struggle with the opportunity areas. And there is a lot that could be done to make this work much, much better within London and for Londoners. And that has not happened. The government actually, in the Levelling Up Bill, we have a whole section on neighbourhood plans, and I think that's generally welcomed. And there is probably a greater belief that the government is in support of that fourth tier and is supporting with the programme. Then there is a belief across London that the GLA and the mayor is very much in support. And some local authorities are fantastic now, and others, I think we still have 9 local authorities. There isn't one neighbourhood plan. And some of the groups tried to develop a neighbourhood plan. It just didn't come around. So I think there's a longer sort of story around there. I do feel that government has made commitments for funding until March 2023. There's great uncertainty around if there will be more funding from the government level into neighbourhood planning, and that might be a great opportunity for the GLA to pick up some of the pieces and help groups to walk along in this very, very complex environment. And it doesn't look like it gets simpler to understand how all these different layers that the architecture fits together. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, there's a presentational issue, isn't there? I wouldn't use the term fourth tier. I'd use the term first tier when applied to neighbourhood plans. But perhaps we need to sort the language out on that, because it makes it look like the neighbourhood plans are the least important. Actually, I think they're the most important.
But does the committee? Does the committee is aware that the 2019 draft of the new London plan didn't even mention neighbourhood planning?
Yes, we did notice that.
So there was only a talk about two-tier system in London, and we have, well, then there's the third tier in that sense. And I think there's a general gap that could be filled very successfully.
This committee's battles aren't just with the government. Yeah. Miss Rowe, about the, I mean, we're just talking about the potential conflict between the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which has investment zones, and the Levelling Up Bill, which talked about local control. How do you see those two working together? Or can they?
It's difficult to, maybe I'll start with the first point with the, are they able to work together? Without my reading of both of the bills, seem to focus a lot on bypassing quite huge parts of community engagement. I think community engagement as almost a hindrance. Without that fundamental change, I can't see how they would work together. Many communities, especially in more disadvantaged bits of London, would love to see the investment that levelling up could give, absolutely. But if that doesn't come with the opportunity to actually feed into how that funding is spent and how that affects the neighbourhoods, I can't quite see how the bills would be successful. No.
Thank you. And to Deputy Mayor, what analysis has the GLA done to looking at who the reforms will benefit?
What analysis? What analysis has the GLA done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've done plenty of work on the infrastructure levy, for example, and the impact that we think that would have on reducing the amount of affordable housing, and the difficulties it would form for local, well, whether it's local authorities, local communities, or even developers themselves. So we have done a lot of analysis on that. But yeah, no, I'd give that as an example. But I mean, do you want to?
Well, it's just, you know, the reforms are meant to benefit someone. I mean, you might have an opinion that they won't. Well,
yeah. I mean, I think I've at length previously. I think I've listed some of the impacts that I think that we have. That's the technical take on the impacts that these various reforms that come out at a rate of knots, some contradictory to the previous set. Yeah, I think I've been clear as to what the technical objection is to those because of the impact.
The objection, but who's going to benefit from them? You've listed everyone who's going to suffer, in your opinion, going to
well,
suffer.
in some of them, landowners will benefit with higher land values.
But you've done no analysis on that.
Yeah, no, we have done that.
On who will benefit?
Well, I've just said. So for example, landowners will benefit.
Right.
You know, so profiteering will happen. I think, you know, a reduction in planning requirements before anyone actually develops the first thing on it. Then the value of the land is going to go up.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I offer just a little bit of perhaps helpful background in relation to the LURB and then the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which we don't really know that much about. But I think the LURB is a package of measures which have a range of different objectives, and a lot of the underlying objectives of all this, and you could arguably they're quite disparate in different places throughout the bill, is procedural, actually. So if you're looking at, for example, the plan-making amendments that are proposed, that's about trying to streamline the process, make it faster, try and make local authorities actually bring forward local plans faster, about trying to get some procedural input from the planning inspectorate at an earlier stage, the national development management policies, as I've talked about the objective for that. Infrastructure levy, the objective for that is to raise more, is to raise more money for infrastructure via development as it comes forward. There are some really useful practical things in there about amendments to certain provisions that exist in legislation already that enable planning permissions to be amended as schemes are developed over time, because that inevitably happens. You start a development, you might need to change it as you go along. So it's quite difficult, I think, to talk about the LURB as having a single objective. There are a range of objectives that have, depending on which bit you're looking at, basically. And there is a bit about neighbourhood planning as well, which, as you've already said, Angela, I think you think is helpful because it introduces something which is aimed at the neighbourhood planning process, and perhaps putting in something that is more streamlined, easier to bring forward, a kind of neighbourhood planning light type objective. But I think for that reason, it's quite difficult to say the LURB is all about this, whether it's engaging more with communities or, pushing the localism agenda. I think there's a bit of it that tries to do that, and that's the neighbourhood planning bit, most obviously, but not necessarily all of the other bits, if that makes sense. So sort of seeing that next to what seems to be being proposed in relation to investment zones and the legislation that, the other legislation that's proposed around that, I think it's quite difficult to see them as two very different things. Having said that, if you're talking about the government's general commitment to localism and local decision making and pushing that down as far as possible, then the investment zone idea obviously pulls in very much the opposite direction, particularly in the way that it seems to be being brought forward at the moment, which is very, very fast and no local consultation.
Thank you. Mr. Dromey, the Living Up Bill allows neighbourhood forums to produce a simple neighbourhood priorities statement. The bill also mentions street votes, but doesn't include much detail on how that will operate. To what extent are these proposals different from the current system, and who will those proposals benefit, do you think?
I think it's quite difficult because there's not a huge amount of detail, as you say, exactly on how street votes on the proposal. It's quite difficult to say exactly how the process will operate. I've got to say, it's probably really difficult to design a system that gives meaningful, that allows people in the kind of exact locality a meaningful say, but which also balances the interests of the wider community, because the role of a local authority, obviously, which is accountable to all of its population locally, is to balance the interests of those directly impacted by any development, those living on the same street or those living in the immediate vicinity, who may experience inconvenience from a local development, with others in the wider community who may benefit from the local development. So I think there's a risk that if you have a kind of street vote system, which almost like outsources the decision to those living in the immediate vicinity, you put more power in the hands of one group of people and disenfranchise a wider group of people. So if we're looking at, one of the greatest challenges that we have in London, obviously, is the need for more housing, particularly more affordable and social housing. But if you have a street vote system which kind of gives that decision just to the people living in the immediate local area, I'm a bit worried about where the voice is heard of people who may move into those houses, people on the housing waiting list who could particularly benefit from those houses being built. And it just
Are
takes...
Are they consulted currently?
Well, I mean, at the moment, obviously, anyone has a right to object, including those living in the local area, but you don't have a system whereby you outsource decision-making on whether it goes ahead or not to the people living only in the local area. So at the moment, you do get some boroughs that are kind of looking to engage with, for example, people on the housing waiting list to give their views on developments alongside those living in the immediate area. But what you don't have is a system whereby those living in the immediate area can just automatically block any developments. My concern with street votes is it appears to be kind of giving greater local control and giving greater kind of power to local communities to have a say, yes or no, but actually it potentially excludes the voices of really important parts of our community who would be directly impacted by developments going ahead or not. And I think there's an important role of local authorities at the moment to say whether developments go ahead or not. They're accountable to the whole of the community, those directly impacted locally as well as the wider community. And I'm just concerned that street votes may undermine that.
You see, I've never met a NIMBY, and I've been involved in loads of campaigns on developments, and I have never met someone who says no development in my street whatsoever under any circumstances. I've never met one. I've heard people who say they're going to put a tower block when everything around is Georgian houses. I've heard people say they're putting in loads of 1 and 2 bedroom flats, but what the problem in this area is overcrowding and an insufficient number of family homes. I've never heard those people. And currently those people, apart from the current in the current consultation process, which, let's face it, for a lot of authorities is just a thing they have to do rather than a thing they pay much attention to. A lot of people just feel disenfranchised, and if they felt that they had some say over the topology of the development of the local area, wouldn't that be a good thing?
I think more say for local communities and those affected by developments is a good thing. But I think drawing if you effectively say the electorate, the people you enfranchise, are only those in the immediate locality of a proposed development, my concern is they are not the only people affected by that development and whether it goes forward or whether it doesn't go forward.
I look forward to being invited to vote on planning issues in the London Borough of Lewisham, which I don't live in. I mean, at the moment, I'm effectively disenfranchised from everything that goes on in Lewisham, apart from our close relationship with the London Plan. Well, I don't understand. And really, do you really think it's that difficult to engage with people? For example, if you're going to build a 27-storey tower block in an area, well, anybody who can see it should have a right to say whether or not they think it's a good idea. I don't see the problem.
And that is the case at the moment. So if you are going to build a tower block in a local area, then anyone who can see it and anyone beyond who lives in that local authority area can express a view on it. My concern is about outsourcing the decision-making from an elected and accountable local authority to a group of residents who live in the exact locality, who are an important but just one of many of the groups who are affected by the development going forward. And in terms of, I don't think that using the term, and you didn't use this term in this way, but I don't think using the term NIMBYs to criticise people is helpful. But I do think that there is an understandable and in many cases rational reaction of those living in an immediate area to oppose developments happening in their immediate area. And I think that instinct is particularly boosted when, as you say, a development doesn't necessarily give you the amount of affordable and social housing that you would want, or it might not be of the quality that we would all want, for example. Those things make that opposition worse. But I have seen developments which have had very high proportions of affordable and social housing with very high build quality be opposed by local residents.
Probably because they were very high.
I know of, in some cases that is definitely true. I know of some which are not higher than the local area, which can't be characterised as high-rise. but which people have found reasons to oppose, people have whipped up local opposition to, and at the end of the day, the local authority has taken a decision that this is in the interest of our community, of the whole of the population of the local authority. And I think if that community then objects to it, then that local authority gets voted out. No one can vote out people making a decision in a street vote. So I think it's an important part of local democracy for local authorities to be able to make decisions on what goes ahead and what doesn't, and to be held accountable for those decisions.
Well, you can certainly vote them out after the fact. Ms. Koch, I was just wondering what your view is of.
Yes, I'd love to kind of comment on this. I think there is a bit of a shame that it's not streets vote.
Can you press your button?
Sorry. Yes, it's a bit of a shame that it's not called streets vote. There's an S missing, because I think the idea that you can vote on a street, whatever we see in our head what a street is, there's always a back of a street. And I think that's a very, very difficult part of this decision making. However, estate regeneration ballots been now happening in London for about 2.5, 3 years. And I think, what you might have a critical view on them, but there's quite a lot of success in bringing a community along with significant change coming. And obviously, neighbourhood planning, we are having referendums on every neighbourhood plan, where all these thousands and thousands of people are invited to vote. And neighbourhood plans are about growth and about change and about improvement. So I'm not as sceptical. In fact, actually, I think it's the lack of good process and the lack of committing to good impact. Because a lot of our engagement processes are not interested on impact. And I think if I could, for instance, imagine in Lewisham, we have quite a few large housing associations across London where we have very low density neighbourhoods where the land is actually owned by one large management entity. And I could very much see how densification and making these places better could be put in a process, a good design-led, committed process that could lead to much better suburban environments and much better neighbourhoods, and a vote at the end on it, similar to the estate regeneration ballots, where the mayor did take a little bit of a lead, absolutely. And I think there's positives in there, I think.
Ms. Stroh, have you got a view on this?
Yes, so I think much like Andrea has said, in theory, having a voice over development in your area is, of course, something that I think we all agree on. The issue that I have with street votes is I think we really need to look at how we're a city of many different people and communities that live side by side, that don't necessarily share. Just because you live in proximity to someone, it doesn't necessarily mean you share the same views on how your area will grow and develop, or even how your road should grow and develop. And I think having estate regeneration ballots, as Andrea has said, has been successful, and I think it's a good idea. But the issue that I have with street votes is that it essentially splits people into it splits people in areas into even smaller spaces without acknowledging that that's just not how many people in London move around and live their lives.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Pine.
Thank you. I think it's important to establish what street votes are and aren't, although obviously we're at a bit of a vague stage like so much of the legislation, but happy to be corrected. But my understanding was that street votes aren't being proposed to give local people a kind of a closer on the ground voice on a particular development that might be coming along in the way it comes along at the moment. Street votes were specifically an idea around owner-occupiers or owners coming together and agreeing that they should all uniformly add a story or two to their homes, or agree to demolish all their homes and collectively redevelop the street. So in a way, it's getting around existing planning. It's a way to get around existing planning legislation. And I come back to the point that Jack made. It is disenfranchising local people. That if a whole street was coming up for development, then I think there is an expression of local will and local view expressed through the local plan, through the London plan, that such a development should include affordable housing, whereas I would imagine that you could engineer an outcome where a street vote development avoided a commitment to affordable housing. So yeah, I think that some of the discussion has been a bit at odds, I think, with what street votes were actually seeking to facilitate. For me, I don't think it is a greater voice for local people on upcoming developments.
Yes.
Thank you. I also think we should acknowledge, and I agree with Jules, but I think we should also acknowledge one of the main groups that Planning Aid for London works with are tenants and people living in rental properties. London is full of people that live in transient communities, and street votes doesn't, at least from my reading, doesn't take that into account, which I think could be to the detriment.
I'm pleased you said that, because that's not what I got from the proposal of street votes, and I was somebody who was involved in the initial proposals for it. That's certainly not the case.
Well, that explains everything, Andrew.
Yes, it does. So that's certainly not the case. It's about identifying that there are communities. No, I mustn't give evidence. I'm here to ask questions. But anyway.
Shall I move us on to Assembly Member Berry?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about my cough today. It's not COVID. Just to be very, very clear to all the people sitting next to me. Do not panic. Right, so I wanted to ask about community infrastructure in a similar kind of ways to what we're talking about, but more businesses and things that have value for the local community in terms of recovery, or value to, as you were saying, Deneen, a community that's more distributed around. It isn't based in a locality, but where something that has a locality might have significance. So the people who talked to us at the previous committees talked to us about things like Brick Lane. We had people from the Brick Lane area saying that, you know, their cluster of businesses, the significance of their area is for a wider community across London as a concentration of things. There's obvious other things like Latin Elephant and the cluster of LGBT communities in Soho. So I wanted to put this question, I'm looking at you, but I want to put this question to Joe, because you represent the central London areas that do have a range of those. And I know that, to declare an interest, which is already on my register of interest, I'm a Camden Council. I know that Camden Council have managed within their local plan to define areas for particular protections of types of businesses in Hatton Garden and Denmark Street. So that's something that potentially you might be interested in doing more of. So the question is any of the proposals coming out of government going to make it easier for areas that have got a cluster of businesses, or areas that have community infrastructure that might help with resilience and recovery? Would anything be able to be done there to improve or protect those things?
I'm not aware of anything in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill or the kind of Room and Planning Bill that relates to that. I mean, what we do have at the moment, which I'm not sure what bill it was, it might have been in the Enterprise Act a few years ago, is business improvement districts, which are a really useful tool for local business communities to come together to raise revenue collectively and to use that to support the kind of common interest of a local business community. And the number of bids in central London has expanded very rapidly, and now much of the CAS is covered by business improvement districts. The kind of capacity of them varies a little bit, but many of them are, you know, really well-run organisations, really well-resourced and do incredible work to support their local kind of business members. And they also work very effectively with local authorities. Obviously, they're not kind of accountable to the local community. They're accountable to their members, and understandably so, given they are formed by their members and funded by their members. So they do really good work, but I'm not aware of anything in the kind of planning rules that would enhance or support that.
I mean, do bids normally get involved in planning processes as an organisation, or not?
They engage quite a lot with kind of large scale regeneration projects. So things like in Oxford Street, for example, the bid there works very effectively with Westminster City Council on the kind of proposed redevelopment of Oxford Street. So they do kind of help influence kind of proposals and work with local authorities on their kind of the bigger planning things. I'm not sure that they are extensively involved in like more small scale local decisions.
Are small businesses, I mean, one of the issues that was particularly brought up at our last meeting was small businesses and also market traders. Are they generally involved in bids, or is that the sort of business that doesn't get included?
I'm not. So the bids that in central London don't tend to cover kind of areas which have got big kind of like market kind of communities. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of many that do include a lot of those sort of businesses.
Because I'm looking at your website. There are. I mean, the boroughs covered by this go right up to Haringey. You've got Hackney, Tower Hamlets, Lewisham, Lambeth, Wandsworth. There are plenty of market areas or areas that have.
Absolutely, but I'm not aware of the coverage of business improvement districts of those areas. So right. I know a lot of them, for example, tend to cover area like the more central area of central London, which doesn't have that many kind of markets, is pretty well covered. I'm not sure if there is one in Elephant and Castle or in.
Okay, so outside of bids, then Central London Forward, do you do much work to help with those kind of issues? And have you done? So you talked earlier about I think LGA evidence that shows the impact of the changes on what affordable housing might come forwards, and particularly something that really I've just read out the list of boroughs where affordable housing is a real squeeze issue. Are you doing anything within those boroughs to try and show that the value of these kinds of bits of social infrastructure and smaller businesses and an ecology of businesses of any sort like that?
So we're a membership body of the 12 central London local authorities. We work pretty closely with a number of the larger bids in central London, but we're a relatively small organisation, so we have very limited resource to go out and engage directly with small businesses. We work very closely with Federation of Small Businesses in London and with a number of bids that do include smaller businesses, but we don't have that direct engagement with that direct and regular engagement with businesses apart from through those organisations. We have done a lot of work which has highlighted the importance of small businesses in central London, including the need to support small businesses, particularly during the pandemic, those businesses which were hard hit and lacked the kind of reserves and resources to survive compared to bigger businesses. But we're not a kind of business organisation ourselves. We're a membership body of the local authorities, so we don't have that regular involvement with them.
That makes some sense. Okay, thank you. That was what I had to ask you. Over to Denise. Back to Denise now. So if you wanted to add anything on that would be useful. But also, can you cover more another aspect of this, which is the need for the planning system to recognise the needs of groups that have protected characteristics, groups that might be more vulnerable. We had excellent evidence from people at the last meeting representing carers, for example, disabled people and people with no recourse to public funds. These people we know struggle to deal with the planning system. So is there anything within the Levelling Up Bill or the local plans that might offer more opportunities for groups like that to engage with the planning system, as well as smaller clusters of businesses?
In short, no.
Were you or any of the groups you sort of work with consulted in the process of putting together these reforms? Your needs considered at all?
No, none of the groups that I've worked with at Planning Aid for London have been engaged. I think there are, but I do know of some groups sort of outside of that who have had some play, but I think that's more with the neighbourhood planning, more of Angela rather than Planning Aid for London.
Okay, and then Angela, you think you were indicating you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity under Part 3 planning data. I know that sounds a bit dry, but actually having these informal social networks, the formal ones, the community, all of those mapped, don't have that basically available very early on. So we know where the listed buildings are, the local buildings, and the other protected green spaces and so on. But we do have very, very little data systematically covered and digitized around social infrastructure, community infrastructure, and also having that properly updated. And I think we, by ensuring that in the next stage of this legislation, that there is a really good list of all the things that the local authority has a requirement, for instance, to be mapping and monitoring, and then that also then be used by applicants and be publicly available, could be a really great move forward. Mapping these, so we have a visual representation what is where.
Senator Murray, I might move us on.
I'm done, but Denise just raised it.
Sorry, I was just come back on that really quickly. There is information that I'm personally aware of outside of Planning Aid for London about social infrastructure that has been mapped. But the issue, and I think this is something that I mentioned before, is presuming that something being online and openly accessible benefits everyone. It doesn't. I think one of the issues that has been highlighted, particularly during the pandemic, is the amount of people in London who are disenfranchised from online access in any way. And then you could also get into groups that have other sort of characteristics or people who are disabled in London who already feel further removed from the system. Information being online in theory is fine, but there's a lot more that needs to go on with that for it to actually benefit residents in London.
Thank you, Zanine. Before we move on to discussing the infrastructure levy, and I'll be handing over to Assemblymember Buff for that, I just wanted to quickly ask you, Mita, one of the key things that we had from the last committee from groups was around the equalities impact assessments and how they're carried out during the planning process and the need for them to be more robust and properly monitored. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on what issues you think there are currently with the equalities impact assessment process and whether there's any move in these government reforms to address those.
The short answer to that question is no. The LERB doesn't address that at all. I mean, in terms of EQIAs, ultimately the duty lies with the local authority to make sure that they have carried out their public sector equality duty when they're making decisions on planning applications. So, in terms of how that's being done by individual local planning authorities, you can see that when you look at any committee report, for example. And I would say, to put this as succinctly as possible, it's done in a variety of ways and with varying degrees of detail, I think. Now, to a certain extent, some of that will be because it will depend on the development that's coming forward and the nature of that development and the communities it may or may not affect. So that's right that you probably don't need to go into as much detail on some developments as others. But I think it's dealt with in a variety of ways. The duty is the local authorities, but I think applicants do assist or can assist by putting in, they do the EQIA and they put something in so that the local authority can therefore be comfortable that it's got an assessment in front of them, that's perhaps quite detailed when they actually go ahead and make their planning decisions.
Thank you. Assemblymember Buff, do you want to move us on to infrastructure levy?
Absolutely. To Ms. Carr, how might the new infrastructure levy impact on land capture and viability in London? Miss, sorry, it's to Mita. Sorry.
I'm happy to go first, but I'm not in charge.
Yeah, I think you probably might want to take a run at this more quickly, or possibly John, actually.
I'm definitely hoping that we
Deputy
will
Mayor.
come to John, because John is the absolute expert on
Yeah,
this. But
yeah.
I'm happy to kick it off, hand to John, and then open it up to the panel if you are willing as chair.
Go straight to John if you like. And I mean, how is it going to affect viability?
Jules, just crack on.
I mean,
Okay.
just go on.
In a
Go
few
for it.
words, this has been one of the longer-standing bits of legislation, because it's come along earlier in this kind of raft of this series of waves of bills. So this is the one where we've had most time to kind of formulate our position and understand it. We are firmly of the view that it would result in more complex and less effective arrangements than the current developer contributions system. Crucially, it would deliver less affordable housing and other payments for infrastructure, and also has the double whammy of putting less viable developments at risk, because the one size fits all, even if it's regionalised, even if there are local variations, having something that's relatively one size fits all is going to make it's inevitable that you're going to put some developments beyond viability. I mean, including affordable housing within the scope of the infrastructure levy. It means that the rate would have to be many times higher than the community infrastructure levy that's currently set by boroughs, and so setting that standard rate with the attempt to maintain current levels of affordable housing, it's inevitable that it's going to make some developments less viable. And conversely, if you set lower rates, that's going to reduce contributions, so you will end up with less affordable housing. We can't see how you maintain the same level of housing or increase it, despite that the government saying that that's the intention. And I'll finish before I hand over to John by saying that we estimate that over the last 3 years we could have seen somewhere between about 4,500 to 10,000, up to 10,000 fewer affordable units secured in referable applications. So that's just the ones that have come to City Hall, not all London applications. That's over the last 3 years, whilst making anywhere between 10 to 30,000 units of all tenures fewer, and that's so including market housing, and it will make them unviable. I mean, it's hard to say in the rough and ready figures, because it is what it is. But I think John's the best person to go into detail.
Thank you. Just to add a couple of points to that, the structure of the infrastructure levy is quite different from what we have at the moment. The current system is Section 106 agreements and community infrastructure levy, and it looks a lot more like a form of development taxation. And the way that that's expressed through the bill, the intention is that the levy would be set as a proportion of gross development value. So immediately that introduces an element of valuation into the process, whereas at the moment we only deal with viability assessments for schemes that aren't policy compliant. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the impact of that is that the payments for the infrastructure levy would be made at the end of the development process, and that means essentially a delay of councils receiving contributions for infrastructure, which enables them to put infrastructure in place as development is coming forward. If you have to wait until right at the end of the process, that means that there will be a shortfall of infrastructure funding, and very likely a gap in timing, which could be years before that funding is available.
But they do know they're going to get it.
Do they? That's a really good question. So, I mean, you can project.
My colleague just said some of them don't get it now, so under the current system.
Under community infrastructure levy, you set your rates based on floor space, but you generally get the contributions on implementation of a development or implementation of phases. So earlier on in the process, you don't know whether all developments are going to come forward, and you don't know perhaps when the timing of the payments will be made, but that risk is exacerbated by having to wait until the end of the development process. So, that's one of the concerns. The intention is that authorities will be able to borrow against future levy receipts, but that means taking on an element of risk and cost, and actually having the capacity and expertise and willingness to go out there and borrow against future receipts and then invest in that infrastructure. So that's generally one of the broader criticisms of the levy, I think, coming from the development sector and from communities and from planning authorities as well. So just to come back to the point about complexity, by introducing an element of valuation, I mean, we know that viability has been one of the more contentious parts of the planning process, to put it mildly. There's a question as to why you would take valuation and put that right at the centre of this process. The way that we see it, the way we understand it from talking to officials, is that it's likely that you would need to have at least one, but perhaps more valuations for every scheme that's captured by the infrastructure levy. And then that gets you into subjective issues as to what will the value of that development be. And that's not a straightforward process. It may be if you have residential units which are being sold and you can look at the sales price, but for any components of a development that isn't sold, any commercial floor space or build to rent development, that means looking at the rents, determining a yield, looking at the gross to net value and making a range of valuation assumptions, and all of that is likely to be contentious, disputed, and could be subject to gaming in the way that the viability testing takes place now. So essentially it scales up that valuation element very substantially, and I think that's an element of risk in terms of authorities having the capacity and expertise to deal with that, but also just making it really hard when you deal with a planning application. How do you know what you're going to be able to secure when your rates are a percentage of gross development value and that value isn't known at that point in time? So quite difficult to actually assess planning applications at the outset.
Doesn't it actually make it easier, though, for developers in terms and local authorities, because up front they will know what they're going to get from a development, and therefore makes it easier for them to plan? Because often I've talked to developers and local authorities who are thoroughly weary from the tiresome negotiations that take place prior to major developments that will, kind of wear them into the ground. Whereas surely with an infrastructure levy, there's a degree of certainty built into the system. Isn't that? But wouldn't that be a benefit from it?
As John just said, no, as John just said, it amplifies all the uncertainties. All the arguments you now currently see about viability, when people have to go down the viability route, not fast track because they meet the threshold, as John said, using his word, it's all amplified. It's all, and also not necessarily just one time over. It's a bigger job, and you're perhaps doing it multiple times throughout the life of a development.
But fundamentally, what will it do to the value of that land?
So, I mean, I think the point you're making is if you have a fixed non-negotiable charge, that provides an element of certainty. Yep. I think the issue with the infrastructure levy is setting that as a proportion of an unknown value, and a value that won't fully be known for many years down the line. Now, you could set a fixed charge still based on a percentage of affordable housing, for example, and say, let's take the threshold levels in the London plan, we're going to fix them and make them non-negotiable. And that would provide certainty, and that would have an impact on land values. However, what that doesn't enable us to do is to look at site-specific circumstances, and there will be sites where there are genuine viability constraints because there's a high existing use value, and that's why we think the threshold approach has worked well, because it strikes the balance between certainty but having an element of discretion. I think the issue with the levy is, one, that it is fixed, non-negotiable, two, that it's based on gross development value, and three, that it's not known until the end of the process. So all of that actually adds to uncertainty for developers, for planning authorities, and for communities.
And I think it's kind of important to think about why the threshold approach has been so successful in London. And I think that officials have, and certainly ministers that I've spoken to, have considered it favourably, yet at the same time not adopted it in favour of the infrastructure levy. I think it's why it's been so successful with developers, because it gives them certainty, and then they can raise money on the back of that. Because the biggest problem that developers say they face, one of the biggest problems that they face, well, now they've got rising building inflation costs, but is being able to have knowns about their later commitments, and so then they can raise money. So what they don't like is going through the viability route, because that introduces uncertainty and then gives them a problem in raising money in the markets. This process is the viability route on steroids.
I mean, I'll one last question before I finish up, because I don't think there's going to be much agreement here. Isn't it the objective, all the home developers that I've talked to, their objective is to maximise the gross development value of their investments? Isn't that the case?
Yes. However, that doesn't mean that works for a system of developer contributions through the planning system, because let's just say that we have a planning application before a committee for 100 residential units, and the planning officer wants to report to planning committee what the public benefits of that application will be. Rather than saying the scheme will provide 35% affordable housing and provide £500,000 in terms of community infrastructure payments, what they will say is that we have an infrastructure levy, and that's set on the basis of 40% of gross development value. What that gross development value is, we don't know now, because that will be determined in 5 years' time when the development is completed. And therefore, there is much less certainty as to what those benefits will actually be. Now, you could try and estimate it, but effectively it wouldn't be the correct figure until you get right until that end of the process. And so it makes it quite difficult to actually assess planning applications to work out what the benefits are, whether those mitigate the impacts, and to translate that into on-site impacts as well. And that's one point we haven't come on to. The intention is still to achieve on-site affordable housing, but to reconcile that with the infrastructure levy payments. And that creates an added element of complexity, because it means having to assess the value of the affordable housing on-site and essentially then give a credit to the developer, which then comes off the levy bill at the end of the process. And a similar approach might apply for on-site infrastructure as well. So it's quite hard to deal with the whole system as one, rather than two separate systems, which is what we have now for community infrastructure levy and for affordable housing and Section 106.
I mean, Chair, I think it's important to note, I think, that now 61% of eligible schemes that are referable to the Mayor follow the fast-track route, so offering up more than 35% or more, and that's up from 38% in 2019, and that is up from 21% in 2016. So we've gone from 21% up to 61% offering 35% or more.
And that would be undermined by these reforms.
Sorry?
And that would be undermined by these reforms.
Absolutely, because we wouldn't be able to, if it would completely wipe away the threshold approach if we were to have to go down the infrastructure levy route.
Yeah, and I would go sort of related but slightly different angle on this. One of the other concerns that I have personally, which is I'll address to yourself, Jules. What are your views on the government's amendment, which provides for money raised by the infrastructure levy to be spent on local services other than affordable housing? Will this influence how much funding local authorities receive from central government to deliver services in the future?
Yeah, well, I think it's disastrous so we need so much more infrastructure in place, whether it's local community infrastructure, social infrastructure, or whether it's the contribution to making the general public realm to a good standard, parks, doctor surgeries, transport, and as well as the affordable housing that we just well rehearsed. I don't see how there is sufficient extra cash currently within the system of planning gain to be able to expend that on general services that should be funded through revenue sources of taxation or other revenues incomes, to use sort of the one-off monies that are meant to be generated for infrastructure, I think is completely wrong.
I mean, yeah, revenue income, but also central government budgets to local councils. I mean, for me, this particular amendment speaks to almost subsidising austerity in local governments, and that is very alarming, in my opinion, and not what, like you sort of said, infrastructure funding should be for. Joe, did you want to comment on this, and then Senator Bess, I'll bring you in?
Yeah, sure. We share the concerns about the impact of this proposed change on risk for local authorities, because essentially we're moving from a system with a kind of fixed and knowable return paid on commencement or in phases throughout the development to one with an uncertain planning gain paid on completion. And I think that has a number of risks for local authorities. So firstly, as was mentioned, having to borrow. So if you want to deliver the infrastructure up front, having to borrow against an uncertain future income in order to deliver that, with potentially having to repay if the incomes aren't as big as you'd plan to. I think it potentially generates risk in terms of community kind of acceptance of developments if you're not able to say exactly what the gain would be and exactly what it would be used to fund, or if you don't want to borrow to then put the infrastructure in up front. So you're saying we're putting the homes in now, but we're not going to have more doctors' surgeries or bus stops or school places to accommodate for that increase until further down the line. So I think that's a big risk, and I also think it's a kind of risk should be borne by those who benefit and by those who instigate. And it's just a bit of an odd situation to shift the risk onto local authorities when and to de-risk those who are kind of coming forward with the developments, which is the developers. So there are some concerns from that. I think the point about your point about resourcing for local authorities is an important one, and I think my members wouldn't want me to kind of not get in that point that we've seen. Obviously, cuts to local government have been larger than pretty much any other part of the public sector over the last decade or so. The cuts to London local authorities have been larger than to any other part of England. And also local authorities, in seeking to protect frontline services, have seen greater cuts on other services, including planning. So planning has seen, I think it was a 42% drop in per person spend over the last decade as local authorities sought to protect kind of frontline services and services to the most vulnerable. And this work is resource intensive, particularly if you want to do kind of really effective community engagement. That takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and local authorities have been forced to cut back on those resources. And I am a bit nervous about an approach which seeks to kind of push all of the funding for that work onto planning gain, which inevitably takes away from other potential uses.
Forgive me, Chair. Could I make a quick clarification of something I said earlier, which was incorrect? I said that eligible schemes that followed the fast-track route, achieving more than 35%, was up to 61%. That's absolutely right. I said it was at 21% in 2016. Actually, that's wrong. I don't have the figure it was in 2016. What 21% actually was the average percentage of affordable housing by HAB room per scheme. That's gone from 21% in 2016 to 45% now. I just wanted to clarify that for the record.
Thank you for the clarification. Assemblymember Best.
Thanks. I just want to, Joe, perhaps to you, do all schemes that are now presented to a local authority with SIL agreements and S106s, do they turn out the way that they're agreed? Does that happen every time? So, for example, it might start off with that there's going to be a public pool provided as part of the scheme. Does that always happen when that building is developed?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. I think Jules is going to lead. So I just say, Jules, as well. Is that your understanding?
If you're asking whether it's what is promised by developers during consultation versus what is actually agreed at planning committee, those are two different things. If you're then saying what's agreed at planning and the outturn, it may be subject to further variations that are brought back to the local authority. But if there's any departure from what was decided by committee and any further variations that were agreed by committee or the local authority, then those would be enforceable.
Yeah, I just want to recognise from local government's perspective that this current arrangement is not an easy one to navigate, and it is consistently changing. It's a consistent negotiation. So I just want to get that balance in the conversation.
I would absolutely agree with you that is a fair characterisation of the current system. But what we are clear about is that the proposed changes make that worse, is our opinion.
I think you've been clear on that, but I think what we're missing from this conversation piece is talking about a current system which also puts a lot of risk risk onto a lot of authorities. It makes them have to pay undisclosed amounts to keep schemes going and things like that. So just want to add that. Did you want to add to that, Angela?
Yes,
Sorry.
actually, in terms of the current situation, again, from the neighbourhood planning point of view, committee might be aware that outside London, if you have a parish council, there is the neighbourhood element of SIL, which is 25%. So there is a real incentive for communities to support growth and then also locally get the funding for basically what's often a project list, actually. And I'm not saying we can have it that easy and clear, cut in London. However, there is an issue between the Localism Act and neighbourhood forums in London will do not get that 25%. And some local authorities have reacted in a way that neighbourhood SIL is basically across the board, but other local authorities have not reacted to that. So that's also part of the current system. And from the first or the fourth layer, when you want to look at it, there's something not quite correct either.
And definitely first layer, as I think we said,
Yes,
first layer. And as well, I think in that point about I think it was suggested perhaps that somehow capital receipts could fund revenue spending, and that would not be a permissible budget. That would, no officer would allow that to pass in a local authority. So I just want to also be clear on that point, that we're not suggesting that capital receipts for development could ever be funding the revenue budgets of councils.
Ministers have indicated that they would allow infrastructure levy to be spent on items that are wholly unconnected to the development.
But in terms of a council budget, you cannot put a capital receipt.
I think I'm well versed in council budget.
I know you are, Jules. That's why I'm asking. That's why I think you're a good person to answer the question and understand it couldn't happen.
But there's absolutely ways of making, whether it's one-way revenue contributions to capital outlay or reversing teaming and lading basically budgets to be able to do that, to be able to have one-off payments instead of an ongoing revenue. It is entirely possible. I absolutely, it's technically what you say is correct, but equally in practice, boroughs can make those changes.
Okay, I think there is some more difficulty in technicality around. So I just also thought that's important to.
So, 5 years of maintenance budget, revenue budget to a park could be saved if one is going to make a one-off payment to a park that's nothing to do with a development. It's the other side of a borough. So I think there's an example of how you could legitimately use single one-off money to avoid continuous revenue funding to something.
We could argue on that, let's not. Okay, just to you, Jules, as well, how would the infrastructure levy fit into the existing landscape of levy rates and thresholds within London, including the mayoral community infrastructure levy?
Ministers said that the mayoral SIL would remain in place to be able to continue paying for Crossrail and any other strategic transport investments post the Crossrail project being fully paid up, so that would remain in place.
Thanks. As part of, we've talked about that amendment, which included the suggestion of local authorities being able to use receipts for services. As part of that amendment, there was some other important bits as well, which may be very helpful for local authorities. For example, making that the use it or lose it on completion notices. You would no longer have to get a Secretary of State to sign up on that. Local authorities could do that themselves. Increasing the level of enforcement, and we know that's a big problem here in London, to 10 years. On those points, what do you expect the benefit to London to be?
We didn't have a problem with those parts of the bill. But I suppose it depends how effectively that they are delivered. I mean, one part of the bill which I was tremendously enthusiastic about was the data part of the bill, with the criticisms notwithstanding. It doesn't solve everything, but it's a start. But I've been given to understand very recently that rather than following what London's done and the data hub that we've created and it being all connected with the 32 boroughs and the corporation, apparently they're only running pilots, and it's money in kind of in a catapult style for areas in across the country to digitise. I was hopeful that that it would that they would have adopted the same approach that we took in London. So whilst I would happily acknowledge that it could benefit, the judgment will come in time when we actually see the legislation and the impact that it'll have.
Okay, but it's good to know that we welcome those. And just one final point, Jules, I just want to be clear on I think Sian mentioned it earlier, but how many letters have been sent either from you or the Mayor on this bill?
Yeah, we can provide an update in writing as to the engagement. But it happens. I mean, we'll gather it together because it happens in a variety of different ways. Because obviously there are a lot of meetings between officials. The Mayor has meetings with ministers. I've had meetings with ministers. And the Deputy Mayor for Housing has had meetings where these things come up because it cuts across DLUC, environment and treasury and. So it's a regular feature on all sorts of agendas.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we are at the end because I know we've got people shooting off at 4:30 when the meeting was due to finish. Unless any of the guests have something that they feel like they came to contribute that they didn't, in which case I'll open it up for just a moment. Mita.
I just wanted to come back to the point about infrastructure provision, because we've talked about infrastructure provision and whether there'll be sufficient money for it or not. And I think it's really just around what we mean by infrastructure. At the moment, the system that we've got is SIL, which is calculable right from the outset. You can figure out how much that's going to cost you. Plus, we've got Section 106 developer obligations, which are negotiable. SIL not negotiable. And you can be subject to SIL, you can be subject to Section 106, you can be subject to both at the same time. I think one good thing about the proposals for the infrastructure levy is that it does create, certainly for large-scale complex infrastructure, it says it's going to be binary, right? You're either one or you're the other. You're ill rather, or you're Section 106. And it'll be large-scale and complex infrastructure that's going to be under Section 106, so you can still negotiate on-site infrastructure that's required with that developer and get them to provide it. Everything else will be ill. What that means is that, depending on where you put that threshold, but if it's, say, developments of 50 dwellings, you would ordinarily still have a Section 106 for that, and you would have Section 106 contributions that would flow from that. If you're only going to have ill, all of that is going to be swept into your infrastructure levy pot. If you as a local authority want to get those contributions, you're going to have to factor that into the rates that you set for infrastructure levy. On top of that, you're sweeping in affordable housing. So your rates, again, has already been said, going up and up because you have to factor in the cost of affordable housing. Now, you can have a relatively fine-grained approach to that if you want. So you can have certain types of rates in one part of your borough and a different set of rates in another part of your borough. But in essence, because you're pushing so much into that pot, and therefore it's going to have to work to do an awful lot, and my point about infrastructure was that actually things that are coming out of Section 106 and going into that pot, not necessarily what we think about as being infrastructure. It can be for contributions towards, helping with the borough's employment and training skills programmes, for example. You're putting all that into that pot, is going to have to work really hard, and the risk of you not getting the rates right becomes really significant in terms of the impact that can flow through. So either you put them too low, you don't get enough money, or you put them too high, and then you start having problems with viability and schemes not coming forward. In terms of how affordable housing is supposed to work, yes, you push everything into that pot, and the local authority then in effect says, well, I've got this pot of money from this development, this is how much your ill would be. Now I can tell you, I'm going to buy, in effect, some of your units and have affordable housing from that. But then, your rates have to be right, because are you going to get enough money out of it, out of that particular development through ill to make sure you can get your affordable housing? And again, that brings in the uncertainty and the inability to actually say, well, we're definitely going to get 35%, or we're definitely going to get this amount of money, because ill is not negotiable. And then also the other uncertainty is that it's based on a proportion of GDV of the final sale price of the development. No one knows what that is at that point in time, that you are going to have to be calculating it, A, through your rates, and then B, again, when you put the application in, developers got to try and figure it out as well. And I think the other point to remember is it's not just about local authorities, it's actually about the people that need to put the applications in too. That process of development starts much, much earlier. They have to start thinking about the certainty of their costs when they're buying land, when they're figuring out how much it's going to cost to build the development, what they can bring forward through a viability process. And that has to be, we do have to have regard to that too. So when you put that all together, in terms of the proposals, there's a huge, you're increasing significantly the risk and how hard that pot has to work, because it's going to be it's going to have to fund things which we don't ordinarily think of as infrastructure, but which are going to be pushed into that pot. You're increasing the risk significantly because you're pushing affordable housing into it, and you're increasing the risk significantly because you're talking about, unlike with SIL, where we can sit down and calculate an amount that is going to come out of it, you can't calculate the GDV on the final sale.
I think that's a very helpful summary, Mita. Thank you. I'm going to wrap us up because we are out of time now, but I think what I'll say is we're very grateful for your contributions, and I think that the committee is going to be unpacking a lot of what we discussed in terms of putting it into our outputs, but also as the reforms continue to unfold, I think these conversations will be continuing, and we'd certainly like to stay in touch with those of you who've joined us today to continue hearing from your perspective the effects on Londoners, especially those that you represent, and Jules will absolutely be working with you, I hope, to continue having those conversations with government about how it can best, a planning system can best meet the needs of Londoners. Thank you, Lisa and John, for joining Jules as well today. And we are very grateful for your time, and we look forward to continuing to work together. Before I close the meeting completely, just a few bits of business. Can we note the report and today's discussion committee? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Can we note the committee's work programme? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 23rd of November 2022 at 10 a.m. in the chamber in City Hall. Can we note that? And I have no other urgent business. So once again, thank you for everyone who's joined us in person and those online. I have no urgent business, so I close the meeting. Thanks all.